समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
World affairs in the last few years have made a certain gloom descend upon strategic thought. One does not need to be a pessimist to sense that something fundamental has shifted in international politics. War is back, not as an aberration, but as a centerpiece of international relations. Yet, the return of war is only one part of the story I wish to tell today. More striking is the return of geopolitics. Barely a decade ago, the term itself was relegated to a somewhat unfashionable corner of IR scholarship. The war colleges and military academies of the world continued to study war because of institutional mandates, and armed forces continued to war game. But mainstream IR had moved elsewhere. Its preoccupations were the politics of globalization, the promises and failures of economic interdependence, the challenges of democratization, and the social consequences of global integration or exclusion. The dominant questions, therefore, were geo-economic rather than geopolitical. Economic statecraft sat at the very center of policy discussions and research. While an aspiring IR scholar was expected to know the history of the world wars and perhaps the ethnic conflicts that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the intellectual energy and synergy of the discipline had moved on. Conflict found its space in new courses focused on asymmetric warfare, terrorism, non-state actors, and the political costs of military intervention, while conventional war was treated as an outdated phenomenon. Researchers who were still war enthusiastic were frequently discouraged as reductionists from an older worldview. But how quickly intellectual fashions change. Today, geopolitics has returned with a vengeance. It has reoccupied the center of strategic discourse and once again commands the attention of policymakers, scholars, and military planners alike. The best minds in the field find themselves grappling with questions of 19th century strategists. For instance, how does geography shape power projection? What is the relationship between territory, resources, and political vision? How is the world organized in terms of interests, rivalries, and unfortunately also war? Today's video, therefore, is not an overview of the conflicts of the last 5 years, important as they are. Rather, it is an attempt to revisit the older intellectual traditions that shaped how great powers understood their geography and conceived their grand strategy. For it is these underlying assumptions, formed over centuries, that continue to influence how nations see themselves and their place in the fast-changing world. So in many ways, this is an effort to then connect old geopolitics with the new and to ask whether India has kept up. So let's look at land and sea and how different powers think. At its simplest, classical geopolitics is the study of how geography shapes statecraft. It says that a country's international behavior is influenced, though not entirely determined, by its physical environment, location, and access to resources. While the theory has evolved over time, this basic insight has sustained. Historically, one can broadly distinguish between two grand strategic traditions: the maritime powers and the continental powers. Most major powers have possessed both armies and navies, but the distinction underlies how states imagine power itself and the instruments they regard as most decisive in acquiring and maintaining their influence. So the classical maritime powers have been the great European empires and later the United States. The classical continental powers, on the other hand, are Russia and China. Their differing geographies have also produced differing strategic imaginations and differing global implications. Now, in the Europe-centered world order, geopolitics emerged as a systematic field of study only during the 19th century. Following the Franco-Prussian War and the unification of Germany in 1871, geography increasingly came to be seen as a discipline with direct political effects. So the German Reich and France established new academic positions, appointing scholars such as Paul Vidal de la Blache to the University of Nancy in France and Frederick Ratzel to the Technical University of Munich to study political geography. Yet, even as continental Europe remained consumed by wars and absorbed the lessons of Karl von Clausewitz' Warm Krieg, in English known as On War, Britain took on a different course. The British Empire accumulated wealth not through standing armies, but through naval supremacy, colonial expansion, and its massive revenues. It maintained comparatively modest land forces while becoming the richest state in the world at the time. It was perhaps inevitable that strategic thinkers would seek to explain these contrasting experiences. One of the most influential was Sir Halford Mackinder, the first reader in geography at the University of Oxford. Now, Mackinder's ideas would become some of the most foundational concepts of 20th century geopolitics, focused on the heartland and rimland distinction. Writing in Democratic Ideals and Reality, that's his book, in 1919, he warned British policymakers against overestimating maritime supremacy because railways, industrialization, and modern communications had altered the strategic balance. The vast Eurasian interior, long isolated by geography, could now be connected and mobilized. His famous formulation remains one of the most quoted in geopolitical literature. And I quote, "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island commands the world." I unquote. As you can guess, his ideas would later shape many of the assumptions underlying Cold War containment strategy. By the way, and across the Atlantic, the United States was still developing its own strategic outlook. Following independence and the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the US spent much of the 19th century consolidating its continental position before becoming a maritime superpower. So when Napoleon Bonaparte needed cash, Washington purchased Louisiana in 1803. When Russia was short of cash, the US bought Alaska. When diplomacy and financial incentives didn't work in dealing with Mexico, military force got them Texas. Only later did American strategists begin to recognize the extraordinary advantages conferred by geography itself. Protected by two vast oceans and largely insulated from the bloody rivalries of Eurasia, the US developed a uniquely favorable strategic outlook. It was Alfred T. Mahan who transformed this geographic reality into a coherent theory of power for the US. In his seminal 1890 work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Mahan argued that national greatness depended not merely upon territory, but upon control of maritime commerce, and that wealth, influence, and strategic reach flowed through the oceans. Subsequent scholars have questioned whether Mahan and Mackinder were truly offering dichotomous or competing visions. For instance, Philip Reid and others have argued that the two thinkers were responding to different strategic circumstances. Maritime and continental strategies were not necessarily mutually exclusive, and both are relevant in how grand strategies get formed. Now, this point became much clearer with Nicholas John Spikeman. Writing during the Second World War in the US, Spikeman accepted many of Mackinder's observations but focused on the surrounding rimland and not on the heartland only. In his view, the key question was not simply who controlled Eurasia's interior, but who controlled its coastal fringes. Despite advances in railways, aviation, and land transportation, Spikeman argued that maritime control would remain essential for global influence. His ideas profoundly influenced US grand strategy after 1945. The network of alliances, military bases, and forward deployments stretching across Europe and Asia reflected precisely this logic. So let's now come to India's continental drift. But first, let's also do some analysis of the classic continental actors because continental powers have approached statecraft differently. Russia remains the most quoted example. Despite having naval capabilities, Russian strategic culture has remained overwhelmingly territorial. Security has historically been envisioned through buffers, depth, and expansion across a contiguous land space. The war in Ukraine, then, is a continuation of centuries old strategic instincts. Naval power is important, but largely as a supporting instrument rather than the central pillar of Russian statecraft. China's historical experience, too, is similar. For centuries, Chinese dynasties expanded and contracted within continental space. Even Sun Tzu's Art of War contains only tangential references to riverine affairs or riverine warfare. The People's Republic in 1949 inherited much of this land-centric worldview. However, this long-held view began to change only recently. Although the CCP gradually adopted concepts such as offshore defense after the Cold War, China's transformation into a genuine maritime power accelerated under Xi Jinping. Since 2012 and especially after 2015, the People's Liberation Army Navy or PLAN has expanded at a remarkable pace. The assertion of China's maritime claims through the Nine-Dash Line and its growing presence in the Indian Ocean reflect a strategic shift from its long-standing historical vision. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had largely been dominated by European empires, mainly the British, and later, during the Cold War, by the US. China's entry compelled regional powers, particularly India, to reassess their own assumptions and doctrines. Now, India presents an interesting case study because its geography is simultaneously continental and maritime. And yet, Indian strategic thought has traditionally been continental in orientation. Kautilya's Arthashastra, despite its sophisticated mandala theory, is primarily concerned with managing power across land, while maritime affairs appear only in relation to trade and commerce rather than power projection. The great exception here was the Chola Empire. Under Rajendra Chola and his son, the Indian naval power projected influence across Southeast Asia, transforming the Bay of Bengal into a Chola lake. That said, for much of modern history, India's maritime statecraft remained rudimentary. Only the rise of China and the growing strategic importance of the maritime domain compelled a more serious maritime reorientation, which we today see articulated in doctrines such as Sagar and Mahasagar, with myriad tools such as the IFC IOR, the IORA, the IONS, and so on. Now let's come to the new geopolitics. The old distinctions between maritime and continental powers remain useful, but they are no longer sufficient. Technology, cyberspace, multinational corporations, digital infrastructure, AI, and transnational networks have transformed the relationship between geography and power. Geography still matters profoundly, as you could see in the Strait of Hormuz, but it now interacts with new domains that Mackintosh and Mahan could scarcely have imagined. Power today resides not only in territory and sea lanes, but also in semiconductor supply chains, undersea cables, rare earth minerals, satellite constellations, and AI, all altering the ways wars are started, fought, and sustained. This complexity explains why geopolitics has become such a vibrant field once again, with a multiplicity of variables never available to history. The permutations of their weaponization are also endless. Strategic thinkers once again grapple simultaneously with the return of war and the weaponization of everything. And perhaps that is why revisiting the classics once in a while helps us understand where we are coming from. I'll be back to discuss this and more. Stay tuned.